Hello and welcome to the Being Human podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Greg Bottaro, and today I'm going to share with you an episode that is a lecture from the CPMAP certification program. So this is directly out of the program. You get insider access as if you are a student in the classroom for our certification program. But specifically, this lecture has to do with bringing together a lot of what we've been talking about from St. John Paul II as psychologist. This lecture is specifically from our spirituality concentration within our program, but you can see as soon as you start to listen, you'll hear that it's very psychological, which is the point of our whole program and the point of St. John Paul II as a psychologist. Everything we're talking about is integrated. We are not separating out who we are in the image of God, made by Him, with a destiny to be united to Him and a spiritual life from the human experience of suffering and or flourishing in this world. And that is a very psychological concept. And so I hope you enjoy this episode today. I break open some really basic ideas of JP2's biopsychosocial religious perspective of the whole person. I talk about Father Benedict Groeschel a lot. We're using his book, Spiritual Passages, which is a spiritual, psychological integration, understanding the developmental stages of life. I talk about the nuances. For instance, what's good about attachment theory and parenting? What's not good about attachment theory and parenting? And I also break open some of the overlaps that we talk about with a spiritual flourishing and psychological flourishing. You know, can you really pray away all of your anxiety? It's a really important question. The answer is a little bit nuanced. So we need to open our minds to the idea of integration and what this really means. At the deepest level, it's very impactful and practical. And at first glance, you hear these big abstract words and you're like, whatever, I don't care. It doesn't have to do with me and my life. But then it's like, okay, but are you sleeping well? Are you handling every conversation with your children well, or your spouse? Or are there ways that your daily lived experience of life could be better by bringing in not just more prayer or more spirituality, but a deeper integrated understanding of yourself, how you're built, how you will thrive? So that's why I want to share this with you today. I hope you enjoy this episode. I hope it blesses you. God bless you.
I spent the last 10 years learning how to help people using the best techniques available in psychology integrated with the Catholic faith. Now we've figured out that there's a better way to help people than just slapping a Catholic label on the same secular model of therapy you find anywhere else. The real question is, how will we make this shift to a new model of truly Catholic accompaniment, keeping the psychological sciences in mind while opening up to a more human and more effective approach? This podcast is here to give you the answer. Join me and follow along as I take you behind the scenes of what this new model looks like, using recorded audio from sessions working with my team, with colleagues, and even directly with clients. My name is Dr. Greg Bottaro, and I want to welcome you to the Being Human podcast.
Today we're going to be talking about the biopsychosocial religious perspective of development. We're going to unpack that mouthful of a term here and talk about some really important distinctions. So we are we're still working through the book from Father Benedict Groeschel here, Spiritual Passages, and we are also going to be borrowing from Lisa Miller's book on the spiritual child. But we're going to do a little bit of disclaiming first before we jump into that. But first, when we're starting to dive into this idea, something Father Benedict does a really, really good job of is making distinctions and distilling out different parts of what psychology can tell us and what religion and spirituality tells us. And these different perspectives of development. In the beginning of chapter 4, he kind of lays out these two ways of looking at spiritual development. And he makes a distinction between religious and spiritual. And I think that this is something that's worth a little bit of conversation, because so much of the current research now is looking at spiritual dimensions of human experience. And this is coming from very secular perspectives. And in fact, when we get into the spiritual child, we're going to be seeing where secular psychology is actually opening up this door to a lot of exploration into the spiritual dimension of the person. And we'll talk more about that. But Lisa Miller is a psychologist at Columbia University. And if you read The Spiritual Child, which I'm not going to require that everybody reads through it cover to cover. And I'm going to present some of the most important findings from the book. If you're interested in the research and want to see that scientific perspective, it's definitely worth a read. But the bias is very clear. And she makes this distinction between religion and religious observance versus spirituality. And in fact, she even shows how these studies that are pro-spirituality are actually anti-religious. And so, people who adhere to strict religious observance are not necessarily as healthy as the people who are endorsing having these spiritual lives, this familiarity with their spiritual dimension of their experience. But why this distinction? Why are we even breaking this up in the first place? Father Benedict here in the beginning of chapter 4 does lay out, he says there's basically two ways to study a person's dimension of spiritual growth. And he says that first we can look at their needs, the way that people's needs for the transcendent are expressed, and how they react or respond, reciprocate based on those needs. That's what he says is religious development. And in another course, in another lecture, we're going to look more deeply at religious development and spiritual development. But here, first we're going to talk about this overall perspective of biopsychosocial and what I'm calling religious development. So where the sciences can help us understand the person a lot better. His distinction, though, between religion being this expression of need and the response, and so it's as we're in relationship with the need for transcendence, sort of how do I meet that need, and then in what ways am I engaging, is distinct from spiritual development itself, which is specifically the operation of grace in the development of the person. This is not what we're looking at with the distinctions made in the secular literature. And I think this is really important to dig into a little bit. And people who are more research-oriented or want to, go kind of find ways to support some of these hypotheses, what I'm laying out here is this. We have an inner dimension. We have a need for transcendence. And what I will call, and what Father Benedict calls, the religious need is coming from that need for transcendence. What a lot of other people in the secular world are calling spirituality is they're actually talking about our religious need. There's the religious sense. This is that the desire to go out of oneself. Transcendence is a need that we all have, and something that John Paul II talks about is anthropology, that we look at in the anthropology concentration, and that he wrote about in the plays and also in his Person and Act, is this idea of vertical transcendence and horizontal transcendence. So we go out of ourselves towards other people, and we go out of ourselves towards the objective, true, good, and beautiful, that eternal dimension of what is true, good, and beautiful. That's the vertical transcendence. And in the plays, they say that there's that dimension of love, that vertical that cuts across every dynamic of marriage. And it's like, look, I think that's in Jeweler Shop. They're talking about how there's that dimension of having to go out of oneself to the objective truth, towards the outside world of transcendence, but it also cuts across. It's a really interesting parallel dynamic between the vertical and the horizontal. And so we have that need within us, and that's our religious sense, our religious dimension. That's not just our spirituality. And when I say just spirituality, it's because what the secular world does is say, well, we have a desire for transcendence, but let's not go so far as to pin it to any kind of objective criteria, or at least they try not to. And I'm going to show different places where they still end up doing it, despite their best efforts to stay as relativistic as possible. And then they say, well, it's not religion, it's spirituality. But then they're really not connecting the dots properly to how spiritual growth makes us better people. And this is where we're at odds with the secular sciences and with the theoreticians who are driving the work that's being done in research and publication. So we're gonna understand this a little differently. We're gonna start from a place where we get it. We know what it means to be religious, and we understand what the spiritual life is for. Religious is the need for the transcendent, both the vertical transcendence to objective truth, goodness, and beauty, objective moral good and evil, and especially as that relates to going out of ourselves towards other people. And then we form together, and we worship together, and we have creed, and we have all these other dimensions of religion that are built out of that religious need of transcendence. And then the way that we receive in relationship the grace that God gives us towards personal transformation and personal growth, so that we can decrease and He can increase inside of us, and we can grow closer towards our final destiny of union with God for eternity. That's our spiritual life. Those are the ways that we're going to see those two words played out. And again, we'll match that up against what everybody else is saying as well as we come across it. All right, so now moving into chapter 5 of the spiritual passages here with Father Benedict, we're looking at what science can study. So we're talking about what they're doing a bad job about, but let's talk about what they do a good job about. And so it's always going to be a mix of both. And that's something that Father Benedict actually says. But first of all, he says, all right, what do we even mean by psychology? This is a really general term, and it's thrown around a lot, but it has a lot of very different meanings. So he starts to say, well, let's look at some of these different things. First of all, there's pop psychology. Now, I use this word all the time too. So we have lots of ideas that filter through popular culture, popular media. A lot of times these are things that are filling the Instagram feed, and we scroll through and we can see, podcasts and YouTube channels, and the media is the channel of pop psychology. And there's a wide spectrum of complexity and sophistication and helpfulness. Some of it's really good. So there's nothing necessarily wrong with pop psychology per se. But we want to take it all with a grain of salt, because the overriding problem with pop psychology, especially as it's communicated through the media, is that by nature, by definition, it is specifically positioned to sell. It's a matter of what sells. And this is the whole sort of driving force of our entire economy, and the way that consumerism works, and the way that the media works, and everything else. So we just want to make sure we really understand that. And a lot of times there's techniques that come up that just happen to be the flavor of the day. And so they're popular for a short time, and then they fade away. And Father Benedict uses the example of a book that was popular in the 80s. And I think the name of the book was I'm Okay, You're Okay. And there's a lot of these kinds of pop psychology things that pop up, and they have some popular draw for some reason. Usually it's tapping into a particular kind of wound or experience of the particular generation. And then as time goes on, those needs change. So this is what we realize is Well, just because the time changes, humans don't really change. So if we're really looking at psychology, really looking for a blueprint of anthropology, it's got to be something that subsists, that continues on, even as culture is changing and everything else is, the different needs of current events are giving way to other things. So this is not based on science. This is based on maybe a pseudoscience of observation or qualitative research based on what's going on in the current paradigm. But these things change a lot. So we want to be really careful when we're looking at things like, for instance, attachment parenting. Now, attachment parenting is a fad. It is pop psychology. It's based on authentic research that we look at, and there's something called attachment theory, and this is something that we study here. The work of John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth is attachment theory, but then it becomes popularized and sells a lot of books and programs and videos and all the rest now. And so what happened was they took some of these ideas from attachment theory and started to flesh them out into manuals and how-to guides. And there's almost nothing more easy to sell to than a market of new parents who are nervous and freaked out about whatever it is that they're experiencing. Am I doing it right? It's like tapping into a need for a parent to provide the best for their children. And then especially when you see, oh no, they're crying, or maybe they're sick, or now there's this new disease, or people are saying that this thing is going to go. Now you bring in attachment theory, it's like, well, they could have insecure attachment. Oh no, how do I avoid that? And then, here comes Dr. Sears and everyone else who says, well, we have the answers. We can protect you from that evil, insecure attachment. This is what you need to do. But the thing is, that's not part of the science. And so when it comes to attachment parenting, Mary Ainsworth was specifically asked about this, and she said, we never said anything about baby wearing. We never said anything about co-sleeping. We never said anything about nursing on demand. These are the things that are part of attachment parenting that were never part of the study of attachment theory, the scientific study. So there has to be a sense of understanding of what that gap looks like. And it's not to say that all those things are bad. It's just to say it's not science. So there might be some interesting ideas. There might be some good ways to look at things, but it has to be taken with a grain of salt. And if we are going to understand what we are putting our heart and soul into, what we're giving our minds over to, and what we're being formed by, especially as it relates to our spiritual lives and being able to walk with other people and caring for their spiritual life, we have to take very seriously what is informing our perspective and our wisdom. And we cannot overstate how serious that responsibility is. And so Father Benedict asks some really good questions here in the book. He says, what do you know about psychology? He says, what are the limitations of psychology in understanding the person? Do I know what psychological concepts are scientific and which ones are pop psychology? Did you know that about attachment parenting? Have I tested pop psychology against common sense or what I know to be true? Do I understand the ramifications for pop culture on pop psychology? So again, using attachment parenting, and I have nothing against the whole field, and I have nothing against Dr. Sears or other people who promote attachment parenting. But there is a certain sense when you're reading some of these books that I remember when we first had our first child, and my wife was reading one of these attachment parenting books, and I actually came home and saw her like really upset. And I was like, what's going on? She goes, I'm reading this book and I don't know what it sounds like what it's saying is basically if my child is crying, I'm doing something wrong. How are we supposed to live our life we have like, and at first she was like believing it. It was a Catholic book, and it was, a serious study, and it was like, now I get how hard it is to be a parent. Now I understand why, parents are afraid to have too many kids and all this stuff. And I was like, well, let's look at this for a minute. And I was reading it, and sure enough, it was kind of saying, basically, anytime that the kid is crying because you put him down, or, you don't run to him fast enough with a bottle, or you're not nursing enough, or you're not this enough, or whatever, that's a sort of mark against secure attachment. And I was like, this just doesn't make sense. This is not common sense. There's something wrong about this. And if anybody else said it who wasn't Catholic or wasn't a Catholic book or whatever might be the case, you'd like tell this person they're crazy. So we have to be careful, because we put our trust in things and we give over things. And at the end of the day, what ends up happening with attachment parenting, and this is a real problem, is that the anxiety that is developed for not doing attachment parenting perfectly actually becomes self-sabotaging for the attachment relationship. And as we get into more about what it's all about with attachment theory, you realize that the mom as a primary caregiver and the dad secondarily, but the parent or the caregiver has to be the secure base, which means to be calm and not anxious. And then what happens is, as the mom is holding the baby, and the baby, especially at the nursing distance from eye to eye, there's all sorts of stuff happening neurologically in the baby's brain that the mom's calm gaze can actually center and anchor the baby's dysregulation that's sort of out of control, and then it's slowly coming into control, and that eventually becomes regulated, and that's a secure attachment. And so you have mom over here as a stable anchor, and the baby over here with neurology that's all over the place, and then through the gaze slowly locks in and comes into place. And then that's what forms good secure attachment inside that baby in the brain. And what happens is, and then what if mom is reading about how bad she's doing because she's not sleeping with her baby all the time, and she's not nursing on demand, she's not baby wearing all over the place and all this stuff. Now mom's getting all over the place. So now you got baby all over the place and mom all over the place, and you can see that this is a real problem. So this is because mom read about attachment parenting, that she's actually doing a bad job of attachment theory, connecting and becoming that secure base. Just one example. But this is what we want to be able to do, is to distinguish between good science and pop psychology. So what do we mean by psychology? And we're looking at all these different terms then. Besides pop psychology, we have experimental psychology, where, of course, we're talking about the animal sciences to begin with, and then running studies which are not human. So, of course, there's going to be limitations there. And then there's also limitations of bias when it comes to these studies, lots of bias. And so we look at, for instance, most research is done on college campuses. So you already have a very small selection, the cross-section of humanity, kids 18 to 23 who are in a very particular stage of life from a very particular demographic. That's what's running most of this research. Another example would be our idea of the fight or flight response as an anxiety response. That terminology goes back to 1932, when most research was done on men. And turns out now that men and women actually have very different anxiety systems. And what we see in women is not so much the same fight, flight, or freeze response that comes from that research that goes all the way back to when research was mostly done only on men. But there's a different dimension altogether, which fits much more with the feminine genius. Also, what we're going to unpack in anthropology, and that has to do with connect or reject. And so that's the way we can think about what women do when they have that anxiety, because their feminine genius is leading them towards being with others and being oriented towards persons. Their safety comes not from fight or flight, but from connection and being together. And this is the way that women have developed a way to engage with that, or rejecting. And sometimes it's reject before you're rejected, or sometimes there's somebody who's a threat, so you don't want them in the group. And so that's where we can see a lot of the sort of mean girl behaviors that happen, especially in elementary school going into high school. So just another example, though, of how experimental psychology has to be taken with a grain of salt. We also can say the same thing about sociology and social psychology. We're studying groups. Sometimes if the study is not focused on individuals and we're looking at group dynamics, group patterns of behavior, there's all sorts of ways that we could be led astray in the way that we're understanding that. Finally, we come to what Father Benedict calls therapeutic psychology, which today we would call clinical psychology. And this is where we're actually engaging in the work with other people. This is going to be what we're really interested in. And so we're talking about personality theory. We're talking about psychotherapeutic approaches, and what he really likes and what his own doctorate was in developmental psychology. So looking at theories of personal development through the psychological lens. Now, he makes this point that most theories of this entire world of psychology is atheist or agnostic at best. And so we always have to remember that we can baptize what we're looking at. We need to try to baptize what we're looking at, not in some kind of superficial way, but in the way that grace builds on nature. And so we have even distorted, broken nature sometimes. But we want to be able to show how any one of these theories has some amount of good and needs to be reoriented in the full light of revealed truth. There's not going to be a need, for the most part, to completely reject or separate from almost anything that we find, because these are humans, same kind of stuff that we're made out of, same kind of stuff that Jesus was made out of, who are making these observations, who are seeking some form of truth, who are trying to line up with some sort of orientation towards what is helpful, but not necessarily going to be all the way there. So we want to bring that revealed truth into this. Father Benedict says, in therapeutic psychology or clinical psychology, as in all fields, the answer is neither to run away and hide nor to proceed with your eyes closed. So we want to go in with eyes wide open, and we want to do our best to bring the light of Christ and his revealed truth into the study of psychological sciences. So that brings us a little bit deeper into a topic that I love. It's probably one of my most favorite things to talk about. So it's the way that psychological adjustment interplays with spiritual growth. This is a very complicated question, and it's a really complex concept. People ask all the time about this interplay. And, when we're on social media and, I've seen these posts and they always blow up. It's always like the most viral thing about, problems that we have. You can't just pray away your problems. And suffering from psychological disorder doesn't mean that you're not growing in holiness. Or, these kinds of things where we're playing with these two ideas. And what we want to be able to look at is, how do we understand concepts of psychological healing, adjustment, health? It popped term now, the most popular, term now, flourishing. How do we understand that in light of spiritual growth, actually becoming holier, growing in virtue? What does that mean? How do these ideas play with each other? You think secular psychology would look at Christ as a well-adjusted, psychologically well-adjusted individual? How do we think about suffering? What about wanting to die to self? How would we look at, and this happens a lot with the lives of the saints when we have hagiography and we learn about the intense fasting of St. Catherine, or the ways that St. Francis mortified his body, or St. Rita, or, we hear all these different things. It's like, well, how does that fit in with self-care? And what is that really how we're supposed to, treat ourselves? And how do we know? Where is the line? And what's the difference? And I think first of all, it's important to recognize that we don't actually know the interior life of the saints. So I'm not going to tell you right now that we have the answers to be able to talk about those things. Sometimes we get some insight, like with St. Francis. And we know that at the end of his life, he apologized to Brother Ass, which was the name that he gave his body. And I have looked at a bit of a study between Francis and his upbringing, having a father who literally beat him, and then comparing that to St. Therese, whose father to her was her king, and she was his princess. And they were, had this very close and gentle and loving, affectionate relationship. Therese did a short little stint with trying to wear, a chain or some kind of physical mortification. And she said, very quickly, I realized that was not what I was being called to do. And then her mortification became a mortification of her will, which she said moved her from being like a soldier to a sergeant in the army. That's the kind of movement that Francis eventually made at the end of his life, after a whole life of throwing himself in pricker bushes and naked in the snow and severe fasts and all these different kinds of penances. So I can't judge his interior life, nor can you, and we shouldn't try to. But we can talk about some of these things on a sort of objective and general way. What we can tell is that if psychology would look at Christ and say that he's maladjusted in any way, then psychology is wrong. But we also don't want to fall into the trap of letting secular moral relativism own the science of psychology, because sciences cannot be contradictory to truth if it's true, if it's good science. That's our definition of science. It's not about putting truth on reality. It's about receiving truth from reality. So if science is done the right way, it's not imposing itself onto reality. So there cannot be a contradiction between faith and science. If our faith is true and science is done in a correct way, they're going to line up and come to the same conclusion. So Christ is perfect. He is completely adjusted correctly and perfectly in every way, including psychologically. So biologically and psychologically and spiritually, he's perfect. And we know that Christ reveals man to himself. So he's the model of good psychology. So if any system of psychological thought is against that, well, we know that model is wrong. A different way to look at this then, when we bring in suffering, is to start thinking about our jobs and our role of accompaniment, and we're looking specifically at a field that defines itself as how good it is in reducing symptoms. Is our work of accompaniment all about symptom reduction? And this is going to be something that sets us apart from what would be licensable and secularly accepted. No, we are not in the business of symptom reduction. We are in the business of increasing peace. That's our job. Our job is not to decrease symptoms and suffering. Our job is to increase peace. Now, sometimes that will reduce suffering. Sometimes that will reduce symptoms. But not always. And even if symptoms are not reduced or suffering is not decreased, that is not an indication that we've failed in our job of accompaniment. Our job is to increase peace. So that's really important to take away from this. That changes the whole paradigm. Now, how can we look at Christ suffering, dying to self, giving himself up on the cross? Of course he's perfect. Of course he's adjusted. Of course he's psychologically perfect. And we can reclaim the role of psychology. We can say, well, some people got psychology wrong. We can have it right. And so we can learn how to walk with people psychologically and help them actually maintain and increase their peace. Something that Father Benedict does a good job of explaining here is he says, most secular definitions of psychological adjustment remain on the surface of self-fulfillment or the sense of self-satisfaction, while in reality they may be neglecting their potential and omitting to do much of what is expected of them according to gospel parameters. So in other words, as we're continuing down these paths and we're looking at sort of what would secular pop psychology or secular psychology say about somebody on this path, and then what would the gospel expectations say? And then if they don't match up, there's going to be some way to open that up and look a little bit deeper and see how actually there's other pieces that are off. So let me give you an example. A lot of times people will say sort of like, what you have to discover your dreams. You have to discover what's inside of yourself. Like, what do you want? What are your desires? And your desires might be for something that's not actually good for you. So whereas pop psychology and secular psychology will come in and say, well, we're just here to unlock your chains from whatever's holding you back from reaching your potential. We would have a different lens there than they would. And we would say, us too, that's our job. But we have a sort of a more transcendent and a deeper sense of what a person's potential is. It's not just a matter of unlocking whatever their current desires are. What goes into those desires? What formed those desires? What malformed those desires? How much of those desires, and this is where the psychological theory comes in, and this becomes really powerful, how much of those desires is based on a false understanding, a distorted narrative of yourself or of parent or of God? In what way are we not yet clear on who we really are? In what way are defense mechanisms or parts, as we learn about parts theory, overriding or shouting out or blocking a deeper understanding of what one really wants, really desires? Perfect example from my own life that I share about openly is my own vocational discernment. My parents were divorced. This created intense pain in the depths of my heart that I repressed. I had a conversion. I was in love with God, with St. Francis, with Pope John Paul II. I wanted to give my whole life. I felt joy, peace, happiness, incredible excitement, wonderful things. And I went to the friars, and I was a Franciscan with Father Benedict, and my life was exuberant. It was beautiful, and it was contagious. I had amazing conversations with people, beautiful conversions that I was a part of. I was witness to miracles. I saw things that would blow anybody's mind. And yet it wasn't my deepest desire. And it wasn't my ultimate vocation. And it wasn't God really piercing the depths of my heart, because deeper than any of that stuff, which psychology at that point would have not diagnosed me with anything, would have not seen any reason for me to still be working on myself, would have no negative thing to say about whatever was going on in me whatsoever. There was a lot going on that needed to be worked out. And the deeper that I went and spending time with real prayer, really getting to know what was going on, and I found underneath that was this wound that needed to be healed. And as that wound was healed, and I was able to restore an even deeper trust and hope in God and His grace, a whole different life came up. And by the way, that healing work led me into a stage that was more painful than anything I had previously gone through. And it was like, these are the kinds of things that psychology would look at that and say, well, that you were happy, and then you went through a period of unhappiness that was something that you shouldn't have done. You made a mistake. Meanwhile, we know the real picture is that God was working His grace through that, and I discovered my true vocation, which has made me happier than anything in that previous trajectory would have led me to. And I knew in that moment I had a grace somewhere along the way when I could feel that if I kept on that path, I was risking losing my I don't know if it would be my salvation or what, but certainly any kind of real happiness. And it was living a life that would have been a lie to what was really in my heart. So a lot of context, a lot of things to look at here, but we want to be able to see that there's more than meets the eye when we go deeper with some of these things. Ultimately, we do see that there is a similarity between psychological adjustment and spiritual development. These are not actually at odds. It's only because of what the world says about psychological adjustment that they seem to be at odds. But real psychology would not have those two things at odds. So this is a quote from Father Benedict. Good psychological adjustment leads to an overall decline in defensiveness and anxiety, thus bringing about a better perception of reality, which certainly contributes to spiritual development. On the other hand, to grow spiritually means to grow in faith and trust, to reduce much of the self-defeating anxiety on which pathology builds. Consequently, the person growing in holiness should experience an improved adjustment to reality. Genuine inner peace is a mark both of spiritual growth and of psychological adjustment. So there's our answer. Father Benedict already nailed this in 1983, and now we're just doing our part to share his wisdom with the world and try to make some more sense of it in our contemporary situation here. But this is it, where our goal is to increase peace. And that is going to look like psychological adjustment as well. But that doesn't mean reduction of symptoms all the time. So it depends on what those symptoms are. And that's a sort of caveat to that question. It depends on what kind of suffering we're talking about. There's some suffering that's outside of being a consequence of our lack of peace. There's some suffering which is a direct consequence of having less trust, less peace in our heart. So as we work on building a restored relationship with God in our spiritual lives, growing in trust, healing those wounds of mistrust, which go back to the earliest stages of development, and then growing in our sense of self and our individuation, growing in our sense of identity, growing in our capacity for intimacy, growing through all of these developmental phases, we will have a reduction in some kinds of symptoms, specifically the ones that come from not having peace in the first place. But there are other symptoms which are not a direct result or consequence of that lack of peace. And so there are going to be things that we, certainly on a physical level and in the body alone, so anything that we look at physiologically, and then there's an overlap between physiology and psychology. So it's not going to be this clear, cut and dry, simple either or. There's some anxiety that comes from a lack of trust. There's some anxiety that comes from the operations of the body. And so the experience has to be sort of parsed out and distilled out a little bit more before we can really understand what's possible. But this is just to say that both are true. On one hand, we won't necessarily have a full reduction or eradication of symptoms or suffering. Now, on the other hand, there will be an effect on our psychological life in growth of the spiritual life. This ultimately helps us come to this place of the notion of self-fulfillment. What does it mean to become fulfilled, to be satisfied, to reach what we're longing for, what we're seeking? And we obviously know that Christ reveals man to himself. And so we have the perfect vision of that. We don't have to go far for it. We already have it. But the theorists who are creating all of the stuff that we're relying on and using from science don't have that. And so they're stumbling. They're searching in the dark for something. They're shooting at things without seeing their target. And they're coming up with different kinds of theories and things like that. So if we look really quickly over the history of psychology, and you could just see this over the last 100 years, psychoanalysis, which is what Freud began, and this was going deep into talking about the unconscious through free association and dream interpretation and coming up with all these theories about drives, and there is sex and there's aggression, and then there's all these complexes that come out because of relationship with parents developmentally. And these ideas create incredible distortions in relationships and understanding of relationships. It's not every boy wants to kill his father and take his father's place in relationship with his mother. That's just not true. So that's the kind of idea that Freudian psychoanalysis, divorced from any kind of grounding and understanding of real fulfillment, self-fulfillment, can lead to. Then we get into the behaviorists, and they start looking at, basically looking at ourselves as animals. And this brings in, along with coming out with like Darwinian theory, and then again, post-enlightenment and postmodern, all these different ideas. Now it doesn't make any sense that we are created at all. We're just all randomly here, and we can study ourselves like animals. And that means that there's some real ugly, hellish, dark spots in our history, like through Nazism and all the horrible things that happened during the Holocaust and all the kinds of things that are happening around the world, even till today, that because of a disregard of the dignity of every single human person, then studying the effects or consequences of certain drugs or chemicals on people become a non-issue. It's just a matter of maybe the greatest good, if it's a utilitarian kind of philosophy, or maybe it's driven by greed and consumerism and an idea that capitalism runs everything, so we just have to, doesn't matter how many people die in the way as long as our company can succeed and we can make more money. These are the kinds of things that are obviously dire consequences from not having any grounding in objective truth and revealed truth. As we look at in the documentary Sexual Revolution, and we were talking about this going through the 60s and the advent of the birth control pill. This is where all that research was done, and there's these widespread terrible consequences from unethical treatment of women and the kinds of research that was done. And then now till today, this horribly unethical treatment of women, especially in poverty, in the ways that these pro-abortion, Planned Parenthood, different places are being set up, and the way these things carry on. So obviously there are dire consequences to not grounding our experimental perspective in revealed truth. We move forward then into like the 60s and 70s through, and we had this new development of humanism, this humanistic psychology. And this is typically what is defined by Carl Rogers, Rogerian, client-centered therapy. And this is all about building rapport and sitting with somebody with unconditional positive regard, which is great. And we use some of those ideas ourselves. However, again, that was ungrounded. It was untethered to any kind of objective truth. There's no moral good and evil. It's entirely subjective. It's entirely relativistic. And so what happened with that was we have literally Carl Rogers himself letting his own mother die without being by her side because he wasn't part of his self-actualization. It's not what he wanted to do. And there are lots of examples like that. Entire religious communities were wiped out because of this fad that was happening. And Father Benedict goes into this in a little bit more detail. It's a little bit beyond the scope of what we need to really touch on here. If you're interested, you could definitely read more about it. But it was post-Vatican II. There's this slingshot pendulum swing coming out of severe repression, and now it's over the other side of total license. And now these psychology ideas are coming into vogue, and now you have like everybody's giving over the keys to the kingdom, basically. And now these religious orders let these Rogerians in, and the way that they're practicing, they're helping these nuns realize that they're in the wrong vocation and all these other things. And I have to take it all with a grain of salt. It's not as obviously demonic then as it is now, looking back on it in hindsight. And, it could say the same thing even as I tell my story of my own vocation. I mean, there was a place where I felt in a very similar place. The difference is I have not made it a final vow. So there are objective realities. People might say, well, Dr. Greg, you tell your story, you imagined your life and you were going to be miserable and living a lie. Well, that's how I feel in my marriage. Okay, so the subjective lines up, but the objective doesn't line up. And they're both really important. So we have to take all of that into consideration when we're evaluating these things. And this is really important with accompaniment, because when you're with somebody, it's the subjective that you're with. You're with a person. And so we can't just come down and stamp out based on the objective what should happen. We need to really understand that me in that place in where I was at vocationally, and that nun who left her order in the 70s, she might have been more miserable than I was, and feeling more pain and suffering going through that period of life than I was even at that time. So we have to sit with that. We have to be there with that. We can't ignore that. The subjective is really important, and that's John Paul II's beautiful gift to us in the work that we do. We have to bring them both together, not one or the other more important. A lot of these developmental theories that Father Benedict loves and studied, and what we use, even, Erickson, and we talk about Maslow and his hierarchy of needs, there's still a flavor here, or sense here, of the individual being the only thing that matters. It's still very self-centered. And it could be dangerous if we take that too far. And that's just a point to note, is that anything that we're looking at, true Catholic anthropology and spiritual growth, will always point us towards the community. It will be both. It's a reference of the individual, and it's also the connection that we have with everybody else. It's not one over the other. We start with the individual. The dignity of the person is infinite. But because of the infinite dignity of the individual, and we're made for communion, we have to necessarily take that step outside of self to that horizontal transcendence that can't ever be separated. So when we look at these other developmental theories that sort of go to the highest levels of self-actualization or self-fulfillment, or even spiritual development in these secular theories, it still has this flavor of just really only being about oneself. Even when we talk about connection with the world, it's almost like the connection to the environment is just as important to the connection as with other people. There's obviously something missing there. And then if we look at contemporary theories, so this is what's going on today. These are the kinds of things that you're going to hear about and probably already know about. Pop psychology, things like attachment theory that we've been talking about, positive psychology, things like internal family systems. These are all sort of good. And we look at them and we're learning from the science, definitely. But the theoretical underpinnings to these different systems are not all there. So, for instance, attachment theory, John Bowlby himself, he talked about how, and this is quoted in Person and Psyche and Ken Schmidt's book. And he, towards the end, he has some excerpts from Bowlby. And Bowlby even is talking about how teleological philosophy has no place in science. In other words, thinking about the purpose of things should not be in the science at all. And he's kind of right, but he's taking it too far. And he's basically saying, you can study attachment theory and you can understand a secure base and good attachment without ever thinking about what's its purpose. What's the reason for this to occur? What's the reason why we should care? There's always going to be a teleological perspective. Telos means the end, the final end cause of things, like what are we moving towards? What's the purpose, final purpose? And so that's always going to be part of you can't separate that out. It's illogical to pretend like we can separate that out. Martin Seligman, who developed positive psychology, he himself has said there's no place for God in understanding any of this. He doesn't really get that he's it's unclear if he's totally atheist or not, but he doesn't really see how it fits. Spirituality is really important. And in fact, when we're talking about the spiritual child, what Lisa Miller did is really a manifestation of a part of positive psychology. And so we'll unpack that a lot more as well. But the idea here is it's all divorced from God. So how can you talk about spirituality? That kind of tips you off. What they mean by spirituality is not what we mean by spirituality, because their system, including spirituality, can exist in a system in which there's no God. You realize like something's a little bit off here. And then internal family systems is probably the newest contemporary manifestation. And this is where we can see Schwartz is really hardcore atheist, off his rocker when it comes to understanding the person. And he is filled with contradictions because he's going deep and hard into the self without grounding on anything that could possibly justify his perspective. And it's really interesting to really watch what he's doing and to learn what he's doing, because he gets himself in way over his head and then has to backpedal and come up with different explanations for things. He gets into spiritualism and shamanism and all sorts of weird stuff, and it's ungrounded. And then he is allowing for Christianity, and he supports Christianity, but only so far. Only if it's sort of the social justice Jesus and not really the sort of come follow me and leave mother and father behind and die to self Jesus. So there's a lot to be said for that. But what we can see there again is that we're getting these observations that make a lot of sense, and we're going to utilize them and we're going to put them into practice, but we're not able to really follow these things all the way through. So we need to know exactly what we're looking at and be on our toes and not let ourselves be pulled in entirely, hook, line, and sinker to any one of these systems. Ultimately, we can follow St. Augustine here. Father Benedict loves St. Augustine. He quotes him here: "Seek what you seek, but not where you seek it. Do not look for life in the land of death." And then Father Benedict goes on. He says, "Spiritual transformation, contemplation, and the ultimate unity of individual and social good are concepts to which psychology is usually unwilling to extend itself, unless to deny them." And then he quotes Paul Vitz, one of the professors at IPS, who I had for class as well. And Dr. Paul Vitz and Father Benedict were friends. And he quotes Vitz as saying that psychology is agnostic in its principles and atheistic in its prejudice. So a really interesting interplay there. But if we think about that, we're usually in the world of principles, and we have to just take it with a grain of salt because it is agnostic. Then we get into the research, and we start to unpack some of the bias that's in there, and we can see that it's really atheistic. And as we move forward into studying the spiritual child and what science tells us about spiritual development, from that atheistic enclosure, we can see immediately that this bias is alive and well.
Thanks for listening to the Being Human podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode and want to help us spread the word and hear more, please head over to iTunes, leave us a review, and subscribe, as it really helps us to get our content out to more people. Be sure to listen next time as I take you deeper into what it means to be human. If you want more free content and information about what we do at the Catholic Psych Institute, head on over to CatholicPsych.com. God bless you.